Once again, my name is Dillon Browne. People call me Dillon. Please call me Dillon. And I'm excited to be back here for our second week. Last week, we heard from the youth of Erin Mills and really got to hear about their experience and their strength and their challenges and their hope around the future as we're coming out of this pandemic season. Maybe I'm a little bit naive saying coming out of it, but it feels like things are changing a little bit, and it's been a long 2 years. And so the purpose of our 2 weeks is really around this idea of supporting resilience or supporting adaptation or doing well despite hardship that we've been going through in youth and families now during and hopefully someday soon after the pandemic. And if I were to have another title for this talk, it would be something like the importance of listening in families. Today, I'm going to be going over strategies that families can use to support their loved ones, perhaps youth, with mental health difficulties. I do not claim to be a parenting expert. I'm kind of suspicious of that term. I'm not by any means. I'm a psychologist and a family therapist, and I work with families, but I'm not an expert of anyone else's family. And that's kind of an interesting point to start off on, because we're really not experts of anyone else's experience. And in order to understand the experience of people that we love, we must listen. And that is a little bit obvious, perhaps. Maybe it goes without saying. However, I think as we go through today, we might find that some of the things that we do, despite our best intentions and efforts, might not be the most helpful forms of listening. And that doesn't mean anybody's bad or anybody's doing anything wrong. We're human and we have egos and we're coming from our own perspective. And sometimes we miss the mark, and that's okay. Here is my compulsory Fred Rogers quote, Mr. Rogers being one of my favorites. And Mr. Rogers says, listening is where love begins. Listening to ourselves and then listening to our neighbors. And I love this quote because it speaks to the reality that there are two people involved in listening. And as I will discuss as we go forward, we need to be sure that our own selves are regulated and mentally healthy in order to really engage in this listening process. Now, everybody's been hearing about the pandemic for quite some time. I did a talk recently that was titled Difficult Conversations, and it was on the heels of the invasion in the Ukraine, which has been kind of layered on top of the pandemic, which we know has been really challenging for the mental health of young people. And we reviewed all of that, and we heard firsthand accounts last week. That being said, I do like to remind myself and others that we're not in the first period of history that's characterized by turmoil and strife and seemingly unprecedented challenge. This being social upheaval has been going on really since the beginning of recorded history. And I have a little figure here that speaks to some of the things that have happened since at least the Vietnam War that have potentially influenced the mental health of individuals, young people, and families alike. That being said, here's my other quote. I'm maybe dating myself a little bit, some old folk singers here. There is something that seems to be a little bit different about what's going on right now. And I'm not going through the impact of the pandemic on mental health in young people this week. That's what we did last week. However, I just want to remind people, this is a study I didn't present last week that I just actually came across this week, and it was absolutely beautifully done. And this looked at the mental health of all people around the entire world and used some simulation and estimation techniques to kind of predict how many cases of mental illness, if we were to use the categorical way of counting mental illness, existed before the pandemic, and then how many new cases were there as a result of the pandemic based on these projections. And what the authors concluded is that there were about 53 million new cases of depression and about 76 million new cases of anxiety. And what I'm driving home here, if we look at additional prevalence, so prevalence is the percentage of the population that has a particular condition, the increase in prevalence was primarily for younger people. We see that there's a bit of an age trend, but it seems like that young people were disproportionately hit. And also we're seeing that this is higher among females than males. There are many theories as to why that this is, and I won't get into those now, but if you have a question about that, I'd be happy to talk about that during the Q&A. Okay, so how do we get our minds around this? Well, before I started studying psychology and mental health, I was interested in why people have mental health problems. And maybe 20 years later, I've come to the answer that it's complicated. It's not an easy thing, and people dedicate their, thousands of people have dedicated their entire lives to understanding why people develop mental health problems. And we're getting better, but we're not perfect by any means. This figure here shows a number of the different sorts of factors that contribute to mental health problems. We have genetics, we have temperament, which is kind of like the childhood version of personality. We have epigenetics, that's the way that environments influence the genome. We have social and cultural differences that can influence mental health. We have a big one here, life stressors, because we all have just gone through the pandemic and we know what that does to mental health. We have family environments and also emotion processing that's related to mental health. And the question is, and this is what today is all about, what can we do about today? And if we were to zoom in, there are kind of two things in that wheel that we have any control about. So I don't want anyone to get the impression that, today we're talking about families and educators and strategies that can be implemented to support young people with mental health difficulties. I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm saying that families cause mental health problems, or that teachers cause mental health problems, or education systems cause mental health problems, or anything like that. All that we're doing is focusing on the things that we have control over. And two things that we can influence are the family environment and also how emotions are processed. How do we do that? We'll get there. And actually, I have a little bit of a formula here. This formula is for approaching difficult or tricky topics in a relationship. And so I think this applies to many different types of relationships. In the sort of relationship I'm thinking about now would be between like an educator and a young person, or between a parent and a teen. And I'm going to go through it, and then I'm going to do my talk, and then I'm going to go through it again. And this is just for repetition here. And so if I go through it quickly right now, don't worry about it. I'll go through everything more thoroughly. First step, we need to regulate ourselves, make sure that we're coming to the conversation with the coolest mind and a grasp on the situation in as much as possible. We're considering the age and the need. Maybe you're from a family where you have children of many different ages, or maybe you're an educator and you're teaching across different ages. Then we're going to engage in active listening. Easier said than done. What does that mean? I will explain as we go forward. And then we provide support. And support can take one of two forms, either emotional support, where we're kind of focusing more on affect or on the feelings experience of our loved one, and then practical support. And in the case of some of the troubling things that have been happening related to the pandemic or to the war overseas, one of the new wars overseas in the Ukraine, one thing that we can do is maybe provide some facts around that. So we will go through all of this. And yes, as I mentioned, regarding my alternative topic for today's talk, that is the importance of listening, one thing that I want to really drive home for today, and that's why I'm kind of slowing down as I'm saying it, is that sometimes listening is enough. Sometimes listening and engaging in real active listening or deep listening, so people really know that you get it, sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's all you need to do in order to meet the person where they're at and support them with whatever type of difficult experience that they're having right now. And going back to last week, if you were here last week when we were hearing from our youth, our teenagers, and I think we had one person who was in her 20s, early 20s, and we heard repeatedly from these youth, you know, one of our questions, one of our prompts to them was, what can adults or what can grown-ups do to support you? And over and over and over again, we heard the importance of listening. And as I was preparing for this week, I really kind of carried that message through, and I'm hoping to do justice to it. So what are we doing when we're listening? There are a number of words that come to mind when we think about listening, and one is empathy. And empathy refers to a vicarious emotional experience that is shared with someone. And empathy is different than sympathy. While empathy speaks to this intersubjective experience that is a shared conjoint experience, sympathy is more distant, where somebody seeks to convey an understanding while maintaining their distance and their vantage point. And this is a Dillon Browne quote. In order to empathize with someone's experience, you must be willing to believe them as they see it and not how you imagine their experience. And I think that we all do that at some point. Perhaps we're in a rush or just not able to slow down, or maybe it's an emotionally charged situation and we approach a moment where listening would be helpful. And rather than hearing the person and what they're saying, we kind of bring our own agenda to the encounter and hear through filters, these filters of preconceived notion and that kind of thing. In this little cute cartoon here, this is a Dillon Browne video. Many of you have possibly seen it because it's become so popular. And this little fox here is having a bad day, as you can see from the rain cloud overhead. And the fox's friend, the bear, kind of comes down into the cave and shares the difficult moment with that person, with that fox rather. The bear isn't trying to solve the problem. The bear isn't trying to fix it. The bear isn't trying to look on the brighter side. Rather, it's simply the sharing of a moment and the sharing of an emotion in that moment. Now, I told you the video is cute. And so we see this kind of Gazelle character climb down the ladder, and you can see this is the silver lining paintbrush. And the Gazelle is doing an example of what might not be so helpful. That is, you know, looking on the brighter side. Or you had a bad day at school, well, at least it wasn't a bad week. Oh, you failed on your test, well, at least you didn't fail the course. That kind of thing. And so while we're well-intentioned when we perhaps look on the brighter side, and I think at least in Canadian culture, if not North American culture, if not Western culture, we're often socialized to look on the brighter side because we're often encouraged to avoid distress. It might not convey to that person, it doesn't convey to the fox that we understand and that we get it. I mentioned that often we're coming to moments of listening or potential encounters where we could be listening with preconceived notions or filters on our ears or whatever kind of imagery that you want to look like. And what is that all about? I'm proposing here that a lot of the issue or the challenge that we get into when trying to listen or when we're supposed to be listening is actually a manifestation of ourselves avoiding a difficult situation. Going back to our gazelle friend, why isn't the gazelle down where the bear is? Why does the gazelle feel the need to do silver lining? Well, maybe it's because hearing what is going on for the fox is really hard. And it's easier for the gazelle to look on the brighter side because the gazelle actually loves the fox and doesn't want to hear or can't handle hearing how bad it's been. And this fits in with the idea of avoidance. And it's one of my favorite ideas or concepts or constructs in psychology, not because it's good, it's bad. We don't want to be avoiding things. And it's so bad and it's so pervasive and it's so common that it's become one of my favorite things to talk about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the very human inclination to avoid painful experiences, which can include difficult conversations with our loved ones, even if we don't know that we're doing it. And that's how sneaky it is. Now, I have to have a definition. In psychology, we call it an operational definition. So avoidance is the act of engaging in an alternative set of behaviors, actions, thoughts, or responses in order to circumvent an aversive or undesirable situation, either consciously or unconsciously. In other words, avoidance is a form of coping. And you can see these pigeons. I'm not sure why these are pigeons, but I just found it on Google Images, and you can, I guess one of the pigeons is a thesaurus, and you can see what are some of the opposites of avoid. And yes, to reiterate, sometimes when we're in a heated emotional exchange or we're faced with a loved one who's suffering, a lot of our own stuff starts to happen, and we might find ourselves responding in a way that allows us to avoid. And again, I'm not saying that this is malicious. I'm not saying that this is even conscious. It's something that happens so automatically, we might not even be aware of it. And that's why I like to begin with the oxygen mask principle. That is, put on the oxygen mask before you help somebody else. I've now been on an airplane again since the pandemic, and they're still doing the oxygen mask. I guess it becomes more complicated when you have to take off your COVID mask to put on the other oxygen mask. But either way, this follows the idea that healthy children need healthy parents and healthy educators and healthy people in the community to thrive. And so then when it comes to these difficult conversations, maybe they don't feel so important right now. Some of these global events that we're talking about, okay, well, maybe not the pandemic because it's in our face, but maybe with the example of the war in the Ukraine, it's been going on for a while now. It's already dropped out of the news cycle substantially. You know, maybe it's not worth talking about. We're all trying to stay afloat here, or maybe you feel like this guy supporting a boulder, that is your mental health, and it's getting tiring. Or maybe at home, you feel like this character. I do therapy with families, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard the analogy of walking on eggshells. Of all the analogies I hear, that's probably the most common one, in fact. I hear kids or parents say, yes, in our house, it feels like we're walking on eggshells, and we just try not to rock the boat or, you know, wake the dragon or whatever. And so in light of an environment like that, perhaps, yeah, like why would I bring up a difficult conversation, or why would I talk about things that are in the news? And what I am proposing is that engaging in these types of conversations are the very means through which we can get out of that situation of walking on eggshells, because they provide an opportunity and a moment to connect. Now, what happens when we avoid and avoid over time? Well, you've probably heard of agoraphobia. agoraphobia is an anxiety disorder, and I guess it's a specific phobia, but it is a little bit different in that it allows people to avoid many things because it's where people are afraid to leave the home. The agora was the marketplace in ancient Greece. That's where the name comes from. And so when we avoid as individuals, we feel this sense of anxiety, we have hypervigilance, and then we escape. And maybe that escape means not leaving the house, or maybe the escape means I'm not going to have that conversation with somebody or have a moment of respectful confrontation or do whatever. And as a result of that, we have relief. We have a lot of relief because escape or avoidance is effective in the short term. However, over time, that escape conditioning or avoidance learning only increases the validity of whatever it is we're trying to overcome that is outside is dangerous, or these conversations are important to have, and the anxiety only increases and increases. This is how it's a vicious cycle. This is another way to look at it. And this is an example from obsessive compulsive disorder, but the theory underlying it is the same. So as folks are exposed to something threatening, anxiety goes up, and eventually we reach a point where the anxiety is so much I can't handle it anymore. So we have to escape. And then as soon as we escape, or an OCD, as soon as we perform our compulsion, the anxiety goes down. We don't habituate that as learn the other thing, that the world is safe, or that the conversation is okay, or that I don't need to perform that compulsion, and the obsession returns. So we get caught in this circle, and we never get over the hump, or we never get to ride the worry hill, as Aurene Pinto-Wagner says. But what we do in treatment for anxiety is paradoxically expose people to the thing that's scary, but only in little doses, a little bit more over time, and you learn to ride the worry hill until you're able to do whatever it is that you weren't able to do before. And so exposure in itself is kind of avoiding avoidance. Now, how does this relate to difficult conversations in families? Well, one, obviously, some people have anxiety when it comes to having deep or intimate or challenging conversation with their family members. But it also is relevant because based on our own psychology and our interpersonal experiences, we develop relatively characteristic patterns of responding in our families, with our loved ones, and with our relationships. Now, these categories are not scientific categories. These are heuristic categories, which means that they carry symbolic value and they're useful for education. And so on this dimension, this comes from, I'll just tell you where these animals come from. They come from the Maudsley Institute in the United Kingdom, which was instrumental in establishing the treatment for anorexia nervosa, which is an eating disorder that you probably all have heard of. And these animal metaphors were generated by folks at the Maudsley Institute in order to help caregivers have cognitive schema or have working models into how their family dynamics kind of play out. They're not intended to be pejorative, they're intended to be useful and facilitate self-reflection. Okay, all that said, the question here is, how do I approach emotional situations in my family? Say it's been a difficult day and somebody walks through the door in a mood, or somebody really transgresses an established rule in the family. What do I do in that situation? And generally people fall into one or two extremes. We're either jellyfish or ostriches. Jellyfish tend to be more emotionally reactive, like the jellyfish, we can sting. And conversely, the ostrich would be more conflict avoidant, maybe less comfortable with the discussion or experience of emotion. And this is a continuum, so you might be somewhere in between. So we have kind of more emotionally reactive, and more emotionally avoidant. We have more metaphors, and this one is for caregiving style. In psychology, there are many different ways of conceptualizing parenting behavior. Here's a metaphor where we have the rhinoceros. So the rhino, on the one hand, if we apply that to parenting or to relationships, is very directive, perhaps sometimes a little intrusive, tends to lead and run the show. And on the other hand, we have the kangaroo with the joey. And as you can anticipate, the kangaroo would be more likely to protect, to use a word, maybe coddle, or try and shield our loved one from negative experience. And there are other words that have been used in popular culture to describe this kind of tendency to protect and over nurture, even in the context of relationships. And again, these are for heuristic value and they're on extremes. And if we were to cross these two dimensions, we can see that extreme patterns of family interaction can form. So if you were emotionally avoidant, or if one were emotionally avoidant and very directive, then maybe you'd be up here. And if you were very caregiving, very loving, and also emotionally reactive, you might be kind of lower in this space. And so we present these models as an opportunity for loved ones to reflect on their own tendencies. I can tell you, I am a jellyfish kangaroo. If you don't know what you are, you're an ostrich. Okay. And then so one of the things that we do in therapy is try to help people identify these, and generally families love these metaphors. They think they're hilarious. Often kids will be the first ones to say, like, oh yeah, mom's a rhino and dad's a kangaroo, or vice versa, or mom and mom, depending on the constellation of the family. And when it comes to emotion, what we try to go for is the St. Bernard. And that's somewhere between the jellyfish and the ostrich. We don't want too much reactive emotion. We definitely don't want complete avoidance of emotion. And if you think about the St. Bernard as a creature that has the perfect balance of kind of emotion and also regulation, we have the St. Bernard. And then when it comes to caregiving style, we have the dolphin, which is kind of between the rhino and the kangaroo. And I'm told, I'm not a marine biologist, but I'm told that when the baby dolphin is learning how to swim, the mother dolphin swims underneath and kind of supports it, lets it swim a little bit, supports it. And this kind of beautifully maps onto the idea of autonomy support, which is an idea from the world of attachment theory, which speaks to the role of a caregiver from a survival function in early life, and that is to provide a secure base. And that base allows the young creature, the young child, or the young person, or the young entity to explore. And then increasingly, as independence is formed, we want to support autonomy. And being supportive and autonomous, it's kind of an oxymoron, but that's kind of one of the things that people talk about as being a good thing in family relationships, especially with young developing people. And so in our broader conversation of listening, we kind of aim for the St. Bernard dolphin combo, and we're being cognizant of our well-intentioned but natural tendencies to stray to the periphery, whatever our dominant style is. And so when we approach these difficult conversations, as I mentioned before, we have the opportunity to connect and grow closer. I think it's important to do this because when it comes to challenging things that are happening in the world, young people are aware, perhaps they're more aware than we are around some of the things that are happening, especially with social media. It supports emotional co-regulation. So the idea that we can modulate our emotions in tandem with the person that is supporting us. It battles misinformation because there's a lot of not so good stuff out there. And it's also an opportunity to model and socialize compassion and empathy. Okay, so if that were all easy to do, I probably wouldn't have a job. We probably wouldn't be here tonight and everybody would be doing it. So what does active listening actually look like?
Dr. Browne?
Yeah.
Before you go on, you have a question that I think you might, I can read it for you, but it's being just around those difficult conversations. Do they all boil down to emotions? Even discussions of health or money.
Wow, what a fantastic question. And thank you for that, Danny. I guess it depends on who you ask, because different traditions of thought would approach that response in a different way. I think that some people would agree with you, Danny, that yes, difficult conversations boil down to emotion. And let me to extrapolate on that a little bit. So in family therapy, we often differentiate between two levels of meaning in family conversations. And one is at the surface level that we call content, like what is being said. And at the deeper level, we have what we call process. So just think for now, surface and deep, surface and deep. Surface and deep, that actually goes back to Noam Chomsky, who was a developmental psychologist before he was a political theorist. And very often when families are arguing, they're arguing about surface level or content. You didn't take out the garbage, you didn't do your chores, you stayed out late, you weren't listening, you're always telling me what to do, so on and so forth. Or squabbling over factual information. Oh, it happened like this. No, it actually happened like this. Well, this happened and that happened and then that happened and well, no, and it kind of goes back and forth around kind of like you're playing detective around like the order of events. But yes, underneath that, what we try to get to in family therapy is the emotion, the meaning, and the deeper structure to the communication. So yes, I think that's a fantastic question, or comment, I would say. It is. Some people might disagree with me, and I think there are probably some therapists who would even take slightly different stances. But for our purposes today, I think that that's a pretty helpful way of thinking about it. So let's keep thinking about it that way, and then we can pick it apart a little bit more during Q&A. Okay, so I think Carol mentioned during the introduction, one of my roles, and one of the roles of many psychologists, is the training of new psychologists. And so I do that at the University of Waterloo, and we're training new therapists. And there are many different techniques in therapy, though there are common factors that cut across all of them. And one of the common factors is active listening. There was one school of thought in the 1960s called humanistic psychotherapy, which is almost all listening, and it still has a bit of residue in more contemporary models. But the idea here is active listening, and what does that mean? And we go through the components of active listening with new therapists to ensure that they're doing these things. And it is something that you can learn. And I think at the same time, some people may orient towards this more than other folks. So I think there are both individual differences, and it is a competency that you can learn. And one of the biggest things that we try to encourage in active listening, well, actually several of these things are listed here, and just in the interest of time, I might not go through each of these. there are a couple of things that you can obviously do. And this slide is from a great teacher's blog, and you can see that the language is oriented towards students. So one thing that really conveys active listening is paraphrasing. And that's simply a repetition of what a young person has said to us in more or less their own words, conveying that we get it. It's something that we seldom do, but man, does it carry a lot of weight. When somebody paraphrases back to us our perspective, it's like, wow, they were listening. Asking questions. Now, not all questions are equally helpful. If we ask questions in a condescending way, like, oh, why did you do that again? You know, that's not a good type of question. But if we ask questions that speak to the deeper meaning of what an experience might have for someone, that would be a helpful question. You know, the classic question that all therapists ask, and they do ask this, is like, and how did that make you feel? And, you know, you don't have to do it in a corny way, but asking about how somebody's feeling is a really great question to ask. Positive body language. So there are we lose it a bit on Zoom, but they're, you know, having an open stance, doing those subtle verbal affirmations like, you know, encouraging. That's what we call that in therapy. That goes a long way too. Empathy, we've talked about. Avoiding judgment, I think that kind of goes without saying, but we'll go into that a little bit more later. As I mentioned, very often we approach situations with our own agenda because of our own experience and because we're just egocentric entities as humans. You know, we have a perspective and that's how we see the world. And we have to suspend that and kind of walk around it in order to look at the world through somebody else's eyes. And that takes time and practice. And we're never going to get it right every time. And then just the last thing I'm going to say right here is this idea that listening may be enough. I can't tell you how many young people I work with. And in family therapy, sometimes we'll see the whole family and then we can break up. And then you'll like work with maybe just a teen or maybe just like the siblings, and then maybe just with parents. And then maybe with like a particular parent-child dyad, if that is indicated. Very often when I'm talking to teens, I'll hear the message over and over again, you know, what would you like to change about the family dynamic if you could change something? Very often it's just like, I would just like my parent or my parents to listen, not to solve the problem, not to try and fix it, just to listen. So let's keep going down that avenue. And I guess what I just said there is kind of the idea of sharing the burden. Don't fix the world for me. I don't need you to. Just share the burden with me, hear it. And, you know, when you're in that intersubjective space of connection and you're getting mirrored emotionally, and you get that somebody understands how you're doing and why you're doing that way, it does make it a little bit lighter. You are carrying it together. And that brings us to this idea of emotion-focused conversations. If you want to know more about this, you can look into emotion-focused family therapy. That is the theoretical model, one of the theoretical models I operate from, and a lot of this next stuff kind of comes straight from there. And going back to Danny's point around, do all difficult conversations just come down to emotions? Emotion-focused family therapy would say yes. And this is because emotions are the boss of the brain. A neuroscientist might disagree with you. We're not trying to be neuroscientists here. We're trying to say something useful. They're at the core of mental health. Symptoms, this is an important point. Symptoms, when we think about mental health symptoms, there are ways to cope with painful emotions. Now let's just run through a couple symptoms and see if that makes sense. So the classic symptom of a mental health problem that is used to cope with painful emotions would be addiction. So people don't have substance use problems. They have substance use solutions to their emotional pain. Another one, cutting. Cutting does not necessarily mean somebody is suicidal. Cutting can be a coping mechanism and a way to exercise some type of control over what feels like an uncontrollable, painful emotional experience. And then back to the idea of avoidance. So avoidance, substance use is a type of avoidance, cutting is a type of avoidance, staying in the house and not going to the mall is a type of avoidance. Avoidance is at the root of these symptoms. So we have to process the emotions in order to get to recovery. Stated differently, and to be clever, you have to feel it to heal it. This is the idea you hear Dillon Browne and Oprah and all sorts of people now talk about leaning in to the emotional experience. Okay, now here is a very concrete example of this technique called emotion coaching, which is just another word for validating, and it has a bit of a formula. And I'm going to go through it now, and then I'm going to go through it again, and we'll have lots of time to talk about it. We're doing good on time, so I think we'll have lots of time to chat should people have questions. So imagine you're in a situation, just think about a situation this week where one of your loved ones was experiencing emotional pain. Maybe you responded in a way that you're happy with, maybe you responded in a way that you thought could be a bit better, but just go back to this place so you can make this exercise real. And according to emotion coaching, the first thing that we want to do is validate. We might say something like, I imagine that you're feeling whatever, and then go on to provide justification because. That conveys that we get it, and not only that we get it, that their perspective actually kind of makes sense. Then we move on to the emotional support. You could say something like, I just want you to know that I'm here. How easy is that, right? Different types of emotional support are listed there. It could be comfort, reassurance, that you understand, that you believe in the person, that you're willing to be together, or that they'll give you space. I'm just going to let you be alone right now. And then we move on to the practical support. Why don't we do X? Or maybe we can try doing this. Or if you have a young child in your life, or maybe somebody who's on the hyperactive side, maybe you can redirect to another activity that is more beneficial for everybody. You could teach skills, you could provide an encouragement, you can offer solutions, or in the event of some family rule breaking behavior, you could set a limit. You say, I imagine you're feeling this way because I just want you to know I'm here for you, and it's not okay for you to stay out past curfew or something like that. So let's do an example, and this is an example from my little picture there, and there's a young person who had to stay home from school because she tested positive for COVID. And then we have mom saying, I imagine you're feeling sad because you have to stay home from school, because you can't see your friends for a few days, and because it was right in the middle of an art project that you were really enjoying. Then we move on. I want you to know that it's okay to feel this way. I'm so sorry that this is happening. I'm here for you. And then we say, when you're ready, why don't we go downstairs and get out those art supplies? We could work on your project together while listening to Frozen. So that is an example of emotion coaching. Again, fancy word for validation, looking at validating. It's validation plus emotional support plus practical support. And I want to just mention that this is not just for parents and kids. This is what you should be doing in your romantic relationship. I've done this with families, and I hear all the time people are now doing it with their bosses or their coworkers or their employees. It's a good technique. Just to reiterate, what can support look like? There are various forms of emotional support, and there are various forms of practical support. The idea here is that every type of emotional experience has a particular emotional need that needs to be met. If we're feeling afraid, then we need someone to help us feel safe. If we're feeling sad or hopeless, we need somebody to help us feel hope. If we're feeling anger, we need somebody to help us be heard and to help us be justified in our indignation, so on and so forth. Now, very often people are introduced to emotion coaching, and they're kind of on the fence about it, or they try it for a little while and they think, it feels awkward, unnatural. Another concern, well, actually, let me go back to that. It does feel awkward and unnatural if you've never done this before, just like anything does. When you're learning how to ride a bike, it feels weird, but over time, and then it's like riding a bike. There's a concern that we're going to reinforce the person's negative emotion. That's one of the biggest ones that I hear all the time. That is, say we have a kid who's anxious, and then we say, it makes sense that you're anxious because, I'm asking you to go back to school in person now, and you haven't been really going to school regularly for 2 years, and there are a lot of kids there, and yeah, it's not easy. That is not going to, in my professional opinion, that is not going to lead to a worsening of symptoms that already exist. Conversely, I think it can diffuse the situation and actually reduce the anxiety. I have a colleague who does this work who talks about riding the elevator down together. And when you have somebody who's kind of in an emotional state, whether it's an anxious state or an angry state, by getting to where that person is and kind of putting yourself in your shoes, you can ride the elevator down together and get to a place of regulation together. Too angry to use the technique? Sure, we're all human. Forgetting it, everything takes practice. I do it, but then my family member responds reactively. These are all things we don't have to spend too much time on them. I'd say, give it a shot if you want to do it, and if you're hitting any problems, give me an email. We can talk about it. Oh, another one, I always get the emotion wrong. That's okay. If you say, I imagine you're feeling sad because da-da-da, and then your loved one says, well, no, I'm not feeling sad. I'm feeling angry. Great. Now you know how they're feeling. So it is kind of designed to be a little bit foolproof because you're not telling somebody how they're feeling. You're taking an educated guess for the purpose of connection. And if you get it wrong, hopefully you're still connected. Some common mistakes that come up. I don't know if I should call these mistakes, but I should say maybe common tendencies when listening. Things that we can do when we're listening to the young person or the loved one in our life. Focusing only on problems. That is understandable because we love our children or our partner and we want them to be doing well. And so we become hyper vigilant around the things that could be going wrong. And so we focus only on problems and not on strengths. Rapid fire questions. This is one that happens in my family. And maybe you haven't seen somebody for a little bit, maybe a whole day, maybe a few days if your schedules aren't lining up. And then you had like 5 days of stuff that you want to ask the person. And you do it like boom, 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 boom. And it's overwhelming. That's another thing we're taught when we're learning therapy is try to ask one question at a time. Because you can only answer one question at a time unless you're really clever. Alarm and disapproval. So that's another one that can really drive relationships apart. If we respond to somebody, maybe because we have our own anxious tendencies or because maybe we have our own views or grew up in another generation or in a different place, and we quickly express either alarm or disapproval. Why are you doing that? That shuts it down. It's over at that point. Talking more than listening, go for 50-50. Minimizing, as I mentioned earlier, oh, it's not that big of a deal, that kind of thing. And then last but not least, one that looks good, but is actually problematic in disguise, solving problems. And this is especially true, I would say, for older youth, so like later teens. It's a tricky transition. And I'm saying this extends into 20s and 30s, especially as adolescence and young adulthood has been squashed and stretched out as a result of the economic reality and the social and cultural times. As children cease to become children and mature into young adults, one of the things that we have to learn how to do as parents is not solve their problems and become their emotional confidant. Because really, we need them to be solving their own problems. We can help them. But if we jump right to the problem solving, like, hey, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, even if that's like glaringly obvious, that's what needs to happen. Well, that doesn't serve to build or scaffold the type of problem solving that we would hopefully see in our loved one over the years. And it also doesn't allow the emotional connection to take place, which I think is the most important thing. Finish this sentence in your mind. I know you really want to go out tonight. What's the next word? If you said but, that's the word I was thinking. And that, unfortunately, is part of the way that we speak in English. I know you really want to do X, but da-da-da-da. And while the first part of that sentence is good stuff, the but, it negates all the good stuff that happened before it. So what we want to do is move from but to because, from but to because, from but to because. I said it 3 times because it's so important. We might try something like, it makes sense that you're upset that you can't go out tonight because some of your friends are, because you haven't seen them in a while since COVID, because it would, be a lot more fun than staying at home. Even though it's not the same, I'm here for you if you want to spend some time together. Practice makes perfect. It doesn't all come together at once. But the general structure is here. We begin with the validation. It makes sense. We provide the rationale because, and then we provide the emotional support. I am here. And if you want to spend some time together, that's practical. You can go do something, do a puzzle, watch a movie, whatever it is that you do. Now, sometimes things get really tough, and it's not just listening with your preconceived notion filters on, and it's not just jumping to conclusions or problem solving. Sometimes things can get quite heated and argumentative. And there are 4 behaviors or 4 relational tendencies or interpersonal patterns, I should say, that can come up. And I just want to briefly describe them and also describe their antidote. These come from the work of John Gottman, who's one of the more famous psychologists in the world. And he became famous in the 90s. What he did was look at couples, so married couples, talking and arguing. And he was able to predict with alarming certainty which couples would be married and which couples would be divorced within 5 years. And then again within 10 years. And there were 4 patterns. And if any of these patterns were present in the relationship, it was really, really bad news. And while these patterns were initially defined in the context of romantic relationships, they can happen in any relationship. And they're so bad that they become known as the Four Horsemen. And they are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. So let's just take a moment and reflect and be honest with ourselves here for a minute. And I'll tell you, stonewalling was mine that I had to get real with. I realized as I started to learn about this work and do my own work on myself, that stonewalling was something that I did. But let's go through them in order. So criticism, I think we all know what that is, right? It's verbally attacking, but specifically verbally attacking somebody's personality or character. Contempt is a level up and was actually the most problematic of all of these. And that was attacking someone with an intent to cause insult or pain. There's defensiveness, which is probably one of the more common tendencies, and that could be victimizing yourself to ward off a perceived attack. And then lastly, stonewalling, which is just kind of shutting it down. If you just, are in an argument with somebody and you're just not responding. So the antidote to criticism is using I statements. So I statements are good. You got to watch whenever you're beginning the sentence with you, especially you should, be careful with that. And so using I statements and focusing on things that, well, I need, and go from there. Contempt, building a culture of appreciation. try to find at least one thing that you can thank each of your family members for every day. Defensiveness, taking responsibility. That's perhaps easier said than done, though it goes a long way for diffusing a situation. And stonewalling probably means you need a break. Maybe you're flooded and you need to kind of bring it down. Whatever it is that you do, meditating, exercising, praying, kind of go from there. And this goes back to one of the questions that we were hearing about earlier, and like, where do these things come from? How do people get to that place? Sometimes I've had families tell me, when they finally get into therapy, something like, I can't believe that we're here. Like, how did it get so bad? And one of the theories is a lot of that symptomatology that we're seeing up at the top of the tree, those kind of problematic interpersonal patterns that people initially complain about when they come into family therapy, are actually a lot of unprocessed emotion. And now going back to that comment we had about anger, I think anger is very interesting. Anger could be the primary emotion that is at the bottom of an issue, though it often isn't. Not always, but it often isn't. And why is that? If we think about from an evolutionary perspective, anger is the safest of all the emotions to display. Why is that? It's because when we're showing our teeth, other people back off. It's a lot more vulnerable to do any of this stuff down here, to say that I'm worried, or that I'm hurt, or that I'm disappointed in someone else or myself, or to discuss my trauma, or to be embarrassed, all of that stuff. Yeah, so you can emotion coach anger. It totally makes sense that that's harder for you because anger is in your face. And you might do a double dip there. It's like, it makes sense that you're angry right now because of this, and it would also make sense if you're feeling hurt because of that. Other small things that I just wanted to bring up before I conclude, we're kind of rounding the bend here. Maintaining routines and rituals, really important, especially during times of disruption and upheaval. And I like this slide that I put together here because, routines, they seem kind of mundane, like how could that be helpful? But if you think about something like driving in the car, a lot can get done while you're driving in the car. I have one family that I'm working with right now, and I think a lot of the good stuff that happens outside of our sessions is because they drive in the car together, and that's a time where people are in a space together and they're not doing anything else. It's their time that they talk, and it works. And of course, we have bigger rituals, and there's a basis for the importance of ritual in human civilization as something that marks the passage of time. Digital media comes up a lot. I started getting into digital media research because it came up so much in therapy and I didn't know anything about it. And I just want to provide a resource for you in the bottom right corner of the screen, healthychildren.org. That's the American Academy of Pediatrics website. And more folks who work in this area are talking about the importance of creating a family media plan. That could be a first step if you're having a hard time right now with one of your loved ones who may be using the device in ways that is not the most healthy. And I actually checked out this website, and you can go to it, just Google it, and then you can kind of click through and really make up an individually tailored family media plan. And it can include things like, where are there screen-free zones in your house? What are the screen-free times? When does everybody log off? Choosing the sort of media that you want to use, so on and so forth. And lastly, I just wanted to end with kind of a newer area of research for me, and this is the idea or the construct of family beliefs. And according to Froma Walsh, who is a very famous family therapist, beliefs are how families view not only the good times, but their problems. and what options they have when it comes to coping or despair. So other words for this are our family values. What are our family convictions? What are our family attitudes? What are our family biases? What are our family assumptions? How do we assume that the world is? And these beliefs, it turns out, are really important for helping families navigate tricky times. They allow us to make meaning out of adversity. Why is this happening? Why do good things happen to bad people? They provide resilience in terms of having a positive outlook for the future. And they can include, but don't have to include, transcendent beliefs and spirituality as well. And I didn't really present much research today, but I do just want to end with this one kind of cool study that I published recently, and this was family beliefs in coping and resilience during the pandemic. And in this general cohort, we had an international cohort of 500 families and 1,000 kids. We've been following them since the beginning of the pandemic, and we asked them about their religious, spiritual beliefs and practices. No religious denomination in particular, just about their religious beliefs and practices in general. And these are some of the questions we asked them. You know, do we feel God's presence? You know, is there a deep inner peace or harmony that I feel? So on and so forth. Oh, I forgot. Also their practices, like praying privately, meditating, watching and listening to religious TV or radio, reading sacred texts. And we also asked them about their beliefs in coping and resilience. So I mentioned not all beliefs, not all family beliefs are spiritual or religious beliefs. That's only one kind of subsection of beliefs. So we also asked them about their beliefs in coping and adapting when hard times come, or dealing with whatever comes their way, or how stress can make us stronger, or, you know, under pressure we can stay focused and not be discouraged by failure. And here I have what looks like kind of a complicated photo, but what I want you to focus on is this diagonal line here. And so we asked families how they were doing in May, July, November of 2020. We've now published this, and now we're following them up again in 2021. We have them again this year. And what we found is that families with higher levels of religious and spiritual beliefs and practices had higher levels of coping later on, controlling for previous levels, and that led to lower levels of mental health problems in caregivers. So lots of things that you can do, as we've been discussing all day, and what we believe is also important when it comes to families and mental health. So to summarize, our recipe for approaching tricky topics, I said we get through the whole thing. We have regulating ourselves, considering the age and the need of the person that we're communicating with, active listening, now we know what that is, providing emotional support and providing practical support, and repeat. It works. This is another study that is under review right now with a scientific journal, and you can just take my word for it if you don't want to interpret these graphs. We see improvements in children's mental health and improvements in caregivers' sense of self-confidence after a 2-day workshop where they learn some of these skills or practice some of these skills. And to conclude, we'll go out on Mr. Rogers again and reminding ourselves that listening is where love begins, listening to ourselves and then listening to our neighbors.